Welcome to the LowCarbMD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
Hello and welcome to the LowCarbMD podcast. Tro, we did it again. We have a great guest today, and this is an area of medicine where I have been stunned by how important it is in what we're doing with patients. And I know you feel the same, Tro.
Yeah, I mean, look, we have the great Dr. Vera Tarman on. She is a physician. She did her medical training at McMaster, went on to do more training at University of Toronto. She got addiction medicine certified. She's written a book called Food Junkies, which I read, I want to say about a year and a half, 2 years ago, which details her own struggles in relation to patients who really were addicted to food. One of the patients in there, was basically like a hoarder. Another one, had other substance abuse issues, and really drove home that message that food addiction is real, because most of medicine doesn't believe it. And her and Joan Ifland and, Evelyn Boudoir Roy and, Brian,
Bitten
yourself,
Johnson.
Myself, Bitten Johnson, all these people who are out there talking about this, we're still fringe, which is unacceptable in my opinion. But anyway, it's a pleasure to have Dr. Vera Turman. She is the author of Food Junkies. Guys, go get the book. And she's got a new podcast out called Food Junkies. So I'm going to start listening. I'll tell you that right now, because if you listen to the book, you know that this topic deserves, time and more funding and more, just more attention in the medical field. Doc, can we go by first name?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, Vera. So first of all, can you walk us through? I know a little bit about you from the book, obviously, and from some of your lectures, but can you walk us through how you went from being inspired to go into medicine and helping people to, holy crap, we are missing food addiction?
Okay, thank you. By the way, thank you for letting me be on this illustrious podcast too. I'm really, really excited to be here. As we were saying pre-show, this is a passion, and for most of us who are in this field, it's a passion. And it's driven because most of us have experience and we found an answer, and then we get so frustrated because the answer is dismissed or written off in some way. It's like, no, it isn't, and it's so important. So my story is like so many young women in university. I struggled with my weight, and although now when I look at pictures, I think I wasn't that big. What's the big problem? I mean, it's an obsession that most of us have throughout life, especially in our younger years.
That's a lecture in and of itself, the weight stigma of our society, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And when we're not even, it wasn't even a problem, at least for me at that time. But what ended up happening is I did what so many other people did. I dieted myself into getting bigger. To basically 100 pounds more than I am now, because I would, focus on losing weight, and then I would be hungry, and then I would, basically restrict to the point where I would then binge. And I developed what in the, when I was in my 20s, it was the 1970s, 1980s. The whole idea of food addiction didn't exist at all, which, by the way, it did exist in the community. But that was way below my radar. And what was happening in the medical world then was the newly emerging field of eating disorders. And even there, I literally dragged myself to an emergency ward one night saying, I don't want to be alone by myself. Please take me in. I mean, I was pretty naive. This is long before medical school. I'm in my early 20s. Because if I go back home, I'll just eat and throw up and eat and throw up, and I just can't stand that anymore. Please take me in. And they didn't even know what to do with me. So fast forward, I just sort of at one point just decided, I don't know what my problem is. I'm just going to eat. and hopefully it'll go away if I give in. And I just gained more and more and more weight. Got into medical school, continued to gain weight, and felt really awkward telling patients, you got to lose weight, when there I am not losing weight and eating as badly as they or worse, and really struggled with that. Professionally speaking, my medical work started in family practice, but mainly focusing on HIV care because of the neighborhood that I lived in and my own interests. That was fine. And then when that kind of ended in sort of the late 90s, because of the medications that came in and basically turned the world of HIV around, I then got interested in addiction. And it wasn't until I started seeing the same pattern of behavior that I did at night or around around my patients, in my patients, that I started to think, boy, there's a lot of similarities here. And in the days of addiction medicine in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was very much still abstinence. And our message would be, you want to stop your drug, you have to stop using it. And then the desire to stop will go away. And it just one day I thought, as I had tried so many times, all those diets, from Weight Watchers to whatever was out there, restricting, not eating, my version of intermittent fasting, which meant just don't eat until you binge 2 or 3 days later. None of that stuff worked. And then I tried this. I'm going to just be abstinent. And the thing that I really struggle with is sugar. And oh my God, it was like it worked. And I then decided, okay, I will not eat sugar, but living in society and people saying, what's wrong? That, you haven't eaten. Anyway, I would always give in, and then it would start again. That whole pattern would start again. I kept looking in the professional literature for support that this was an addiction, and it didn't exist then. So I just had to sort of make a hard rule for myself. Now that I'm doing podcasts, I'm actually meeting people who were like me in those days. Like, I wasn't the only one, but we didn't have internet like we do now, and podcasts like we do now. And so there were like many of me's, like isolated people in various places, but we didn't know each other to support each other. Anyway, it wasn't until I came across Nora Volkow's sort of, in my mind, landmark journal, which talked about a sugar addiction as being an addiction as powerful as cocaine. She was part of the Nicola Vina rats who choose sucrose or even a sweetener over cocaine. When I saw that research, that I thought, okay, now there's actual hardcore research, and that's when I started my campaign. And that was about like a little over 15 years ago. And it's just been gradually growing. And you mentioned, Troy, something about niche. I was told many times, you got to write a book. And writing a book is not simple. It's not like, oh, I'm going to write a book. It's a commitment. I know enough about writing to know that it's a real commitment. I didn't want to do it. And then trying to get it published is yet another commitment, having to knock on doors and say, please. And the message I kept getting was, this is a niche topic. Nobody's going to be interested in this except a few people who are addicted, and there's not many of them. And I just wanted to pull my hair and say, that's not true. Actually, there's a lot more of us than we think. And that's just been my experience.
I want to just give you one little statistic here. We probably have had over, 2,000-3,000 people come into our weight loss program, and we've done Y-Fast, we've done the Yale Food Addiction Scale, and the binge eating scale on every single patient, right? And I'm going to tell you, it just could be that all the food addiction people are finding us, but let me tell you, between the ACE questionnaire, the Adverse Childhood Events questionnaire, and the Yale Food Addiction Scale, there is the overwhelming majority, okay, that is not being properly addressed by this idea that food addiction is niche. So Dr. Vera, how do you deal with your patients kind of struggling with something you yourself didn't understand? They maybe had obesity. You saw that they potentially were addicted. And how do you reconcile the fact that you kind of didn't have a handle of all this?
Okay.
This is
so
15 years ago, 20 years ago, you know?
yeah, we have a great capacity, I think, as human beings, and I was very good at this, at compartmentalizing, separating ourselves from each other. So, you know, there was the patient, there was me, the doctor, and I somehow, first of all, even though I recognized the pattern, I still felt somehow apart, and you know, it's part of that medical training. So there was that piece. The other thing is that I also, here's where I see that there's a real connection. I also struggled with alcohol abuse in my younger years. And the way that I saw my food was, I'm treating, because I stopped drinking, I couldn't drink and be a sort of competent doctor. So the way that I treated myself was through using food. And so I saw it as, this is kind of like my alcohol issue, but now being taken care of with food. And so it was over there, dealt with and sort of cured, as it were. And the fact that I'm getting bigger and bigger and bigger, it's like not connecting the dots. And this is what addiction does, is we don't connect the dots. And I somehow thought that I'm getting bigger because I have a Germanic background, and you know, some of us are big and hefty, and that's me, and I'm just coming into my own genetic body. And the fact that it was because of weight, it just, I'm now astounded. But
so you were disenfranchised. So basically, you were disenfranchised.
Well,
right?
I guess. And also I lived, you know, I came from a sort of feminist background, and there was the whole idea about weight stigma and shaming. And so when I would talk to somebody, I would say, you know, your weight is, you've got diabetes, and the best way to treat diabetes is to lose weight. And I didn't know then about the whole insulin and all of that stuff. That just wasn't part of the, it's still actually not part of our general medical training. I just knew that if you lost weight, you would, your insulin or your diabetes would improve, and maybe even to the point where you could stop insulin. So I would encourage weight loss from that point of view, trying to dance around the issue that, you know, I could be shaming the person. So there was a lot of blinders built in, and I was part of that completely.
Yeah, I think we were all part of that. I think
Yeah.
you're looking, think no one's listening. We put them on insulin, they gain 20 pounds. Like, you're not listening. We told you to lose weight. Then they're gaining weight. We put them on more insulin because they're not compliant. And then, you know, that whole, and that's why doctors are burned out now. We're seeing this whole, you know, because people aren't getting better, they get worse and worse. Now we get happy seeing these changes. And I'll tell you, from my twisting of my mind, it actually happened directly on this podcast, episode number 10, talking to Rob Sivas, saying this is an addiction problem. It's not just because you like cookies. It's not just because, for a lot of people, not everyone, but for a lot of people. And then we had episode number 13, which we knew was going to be controversial at the time, where we had Carnivore Cruz talking about pornography, alcohol addiction, all these other addictions, that when he got his diet right, all those other things fell. And I hear that weekly now, where people say, yeah, I quit drinking after I quit carbs. I didn't crave alcohol as much. Now I'm exercising more. Now the stories we hear are just, if I didn't see them directly, I wouldn't believe them.
I know, and even to this day now, so I know this now, and I still have to be very careful with patients. If they're coming in with an addiction, you know, there's a stigma about addiction. If they're coming in with an addiction, for me to say, well, maybe food might be a way that you're dealing with your addiction because they're gaining weight or something like that, and they're more likely to say, yeah, probably, because they've kind of got over the hump of they have an addiction. But I still struggle to this day with people who are maybe not seeing me for a food addiction, who, or maybe because of obesity or something like that, who still struggle over the idea that this is an addiction because they don't want to take on yet another stigma and another, it's a real mind thing you have to get over.
I think one of the problems that I've noticed is the lack of education of doctors. So you've educated all of us with your book, right? Food Junkies, about what is this process of food addiction, the lack of research. You mentioned, Volkow, right? You mentioned, I've seen her TED Talk. She just, actually fast forward from her TED Talk about 10 years ago to now, she just published a study showing that low carbohydrate eating decreases the need for seizure medication in alcohol withdrawal. and
Yeah,
decreases
wow.
the need, the desire for alcohol.
Yeah,
So, you know, we were talking about this 3 years ago, Brian, on
yeah,
our podcast, right? So the fact that this research isn't even out there.
And we'll
right?
throw in that several doctors said we should have our license removed for even considering it. They
yeah.
said we could lose our license over even discussing that there could be some cross addictivity, right? Addiction could be crossed between all these things. Well, I said, well, if someone quit smoking, they gain weight. Why? Because they stop smoking, they eat, right? So there's so many of these things that we see that say we're seeing this. We're not saying we're not the addiction experts. We're just seeing this clinically that our patients are reporting this to us. We're not making this up. So that the fact that people would be so offended to say publicly on Twitter that we should have our license removed for even discussing this, say, hey, is this a possibility? We're seeing it. Is this possible? And even questioning it was a problem.
Well, that's worse than I thought. I just get resistance in, you know, in the office chair. I didn't know that people would actually get hostile about it.
Yeah, I think the problem is also, you know, to go back to, even if you were interested, right? Let's say 15 years ago, you figured it out. I mean, you could figure it out. I did a CAGE questionnaire about 9 years ago on a patient. Okay, the CAGE questionnaire, you obviously know about it. Our patients may not, the listeners may not know about it. It's, you know, a questionnaire. You ask people if they want to cut down on their alcohol, or do they get agitated, you know, when they somebody says, do you want to cut down? Do they feel guilty or shameful about their use of alcohol? And do they sometimes feel so compelled to drink that they have it at off hours, right? And this is the CAGE questionnaire, right? And if you just apply that to food, right, it's simple. And in fact, if we do this on every patient that walks in the door, everybody is CAGE positive for food. Right. So it's right there. I mean, it's not hard to understand food addiction, but the mainstream dietetics, they don't even recognize food addiction. And can you talk about that? So even 15 years ago, if you understood this, right, what's the opposition, you know, amongst our peers?
Amongst our peers, well, I think that we can look at almost like three different angles. Of course, the food industry doesn't support this idea at all, because it's all it's taking it out of the individual agency of, you know, I should just control myself, and putting it onto them, which is they're the pushers. They're the ones that have engineered this food to make it very difficult for even a non-addict to say no. I mean, I think we're all at some level, you know, CAGE, probably at least one of those four criteria would get fit by 100% of the population, just because if we eat the food that we eat today, not the low carb stuff, but the stuff, the standard American diet stuff, I don't think we can get away from being addicted to at some level, maybe not a syndrome. So there's the food industry. Then there's the whole professional, Robert Lustig in his latest book says it very well. He says, I was amazed that he said it so clearly. He said, we kind of have to let those guys die off, you know, that old way of thinking, because people hold on to their ideas so strongly. And this idea that it can be medically managed, which is of course the medication industry too, the pharmaceuticals. Oh my God, and the worst culprits for that is the whole obesity area, the bariatric clinicians, where they just hold on to the fact that it's the medications that can treat this, not the food. So, you know, there's vested interests, sort of big vested interests that are not going to support this idea. And then there's just professional interests, like, so there's the vested interests of, if I've had the diabetic, like insulin companies for insulin, come to me and say, would you like us to fund a talk? And I say no, because my goal is that we won't need you, and I want to promote that message, and I don't think you're going to let me do that, or support me in doing that. So there's that piece. And then if a medical clinician is looking at a client and is struggling with food, why would they look further than what's already available to them? So just get them on a diet, and we'll send them to the dietitian around the corner. Or if at worst, we'll send them to an eating disorder clinic, which is the whole, you know, is it binge eating disorder or bulimia or something like that? Why would we add another layer? Because we've already got two that sufficiently explain it. And we know that, I think you mentioned it, well, I don't know if you did, but you mentioned CAGE, you mentioned the food addiction, Ashley Gearhart's scale, and then and throw in any eating disorder scale, and they'll pass that too. It all looks the same. So you've got professional interests that are getting funded well, already dealing with this issue, so we don't need a third one. And that's the problem with the DSM-5. They don't yet, and hopefully that will change, but they don't yet want to embrace food addiction, because why do they need to? We've already got an explanation: binge eating disorder or eating disorder. So let's show us how it's different so that we can make a separate diagnosis, and we're still struggling with that. That's a problem. And it's partly because we need to get clinical research. We have to be outside the realm of sort of pure research, like using rats and you know,
Can I ask you a question?
Like that. We need people. Yeah.
Can I, Brian? I don't know if you're unmuted before me, so maybe I'll let you chime in.
No, I'm good, Joe.
Yeah. So look at me, like, you know, I'm letting my elders go first. But okay, so look, the question is this: to what extent, right? To what extent do you think that this opposition, right, has made this like not come out to the forefront? Because you and we could very easily connect the dots.
Yes.
Right? So how is it, like, you're a smart doctor, you suffered from this. Brian's a smart doctor, he suffered from this. I'm a smart doctor, I've suffered from this. So we're three smart people who should be able to connect the dots. I mean, is this all it takes? Like a medical industry, a food industry, and medical organizations that don't really that don't want to figure this out. Is that all it takes to? Well,
it's an intuitive connecting the dots. So now, how do you actually make a science out of this? So you have to find a way to diagnose this. But you know, so there's. I'm going to give you two examples that happened in the last year. One is our it's called CAMH, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. So it's our big academic center in Toronto. And they actually, there's a couple of smart guys there, or open-minded guys that are addiction doctors, who said, yeah, let's look at this issue of food addiction. And I was thrilled, because I was really one of the only ones in Toronto at that point. And you know, the fact that we're actually now having a conversation, great. Now, most addiction doctors are not interested in this issue because they're all focused on the whole opiate crisis. And all the young doctors that are super keen are all there. So food it's nothing compared to people dying of opiate addiction on the street. So they've been kind of focused there. So we have a few people looking at this food thing, and we get stuck on things like, should it be called sugar addiction or carb addiction or processed food addiction? And we spend the whole hour talking about that, rather than.
What do you think it should be? What do you think? I'm just curious. What do you think it should be?
I actually think it should be called processed food addiction, and then the variations of that. And then some people say, well, it should be eating addiction. But you see, the thing about food addiction is that it starts off with processed foods, mainly sugar, then refined carbs and refined sugar. But as the condition continues and progresses, because like any addiction disorder, things progress and get worse. Eventually, as the person gets into later stages of addiction, like middle, late stage, even foods that would not be triggering for somebody else, like dairy or nuts or grains, are now addictive. And later on, even volume, like good food, like Brussels sprouts, you can eat too many of those, because the whole concept of wanting more and not being satisfied, you can still struggle with addiction, even with a low carb, good health thing. So it's more than just the food. But
we're going to be best friends. We're going to be best friends. It should be food addiction. I 100% agree with you.
Yeah.
It should be called food addiction.
Yeah.
And I'm 100, because it's called alcohol addiction or substance abuse, right? It's called heroin addiction. It is food addiction. That is the proper word. Nobody spoons sugar into their mouth. I haven't seen that, although some people may, but nobody spoons flour into their mouth, right? So we should call it what it is. It's food addiction. I 100% agree. Brian, what do you think?
Well,
I agree. Yeah, I agree. And I think the other very key component, and this is what I've really been focusing on, is how stress contributes to this addiction, right? Because the more stressed people are. If you're a stress eater, what are you gonna do? You're just gonna grab whatever you can find. My dad, I remember when we were kids, like he'd get stressed out and he would grab a cigarette. That was his. And whenever we saw dad grab a cigarette, we knew he was stressed out, right? Because that was his. That's what he did. Was so other people are gonna grab a drink when they get home. So seeing this whole people are highly stressed, they're overstimulated. There's really, especially nowadays with COVID, the pathology we're seeing is unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. So there's the mental health derangement, it's basically COVID has made mental health on steroids. It's made everything exponentiated. And then, also as the person is more stressed out, their whole hormonal regulation is thrown askew as well. Like they become more insulin sensitive. Like it's not just the sort of dopamine pathways in the brain. It's also the other stuff, other satiety generators or our appetite generators are also thrown askew. Everything gets thrown askew with stress, and it becomes much more harder to manage. But can I finish? I wanted to just say that I had two examples. There was the CAMH example this year, back to this conversation about professional. And then there's also, we have the obesity doctors here in Toronto in Canada. Although they have invited the discussion about food addiction, most of the conferences are still focused on what are the best surgical or medical interventions, not even dietary, and certainly not with dietary with food addiction in mind. That's still considered fringe.
I wrote a piece at the last obesity week I went to in 2019 about what a disastrous failure and what hypocrites they all are. Right? They literally, the head of the ADA gets on top of a podium giving a keynote lecture saying that, there is no diabetes diet, any diet that works, just eat whole grains, fruits, and lean meat.
Wow.
I thought to myself, what an implicit bias that's built into these people, where they can, on the same breath, say all diets are acceptable, but eat more fruits, more grains, and lean meats. Right? I mean, it's just the medical field is not supportive of lowering your sugar and lowering your carbohydrates. And if they are, it comes with some caveat, which is rooted in an energetics model of obesity and not a fundamental, addiction and impulse driven, model for obesity, which is what we need. And if you look at stress, you mentioned stress, and Brian mentioned stress, it's literally a comfort deficiency, yes. Yeah. But we're talking about blood flow changes in the brain. We're talking about blood sugar changes, literally causing insulin resistance in an instant. I mean, Brian, when your wife's upset at you and is putting you in the doghouse.
She doesn't get upset with me, Tro.
I know. All my what happens to your blood sugar?
Yeah, of course. Spikes. We see it on the continuous glucose monitor. We're watching it. So what happened on Wednesday? Oh, I got into a fight with my wife and we were arguing about the garage, and this person was arguing, and you see it on the continuous glucose monitor. We see them spike with the stress hormones. Wow. And then people say, well, stress doesn't affect it. Well, I can tell you from 100% with 100% certainty, based on who I talk to, what I'm seeing, this is a major factor in physiology.
Yeah. And it's not just that, it's not just the psychological component, right? Where you're stressed out and you're distracted, or maybe you just have a need for something good, right? It's not just that. I mean, on a hormonal physiologic level, we don't control that. We don't control any of that. Yeah. So anyway, so in your experience, what have you seen with regards to stress and relapse and stress and changing addictions? If you're dealing with food, you mentioned yourself, when you came off alcohol, you switched to food. Yeah. And we know in bypass, when you come off food, right, you turn to alcohol. Yeah. So what have you seen about this addiction transfer? What role does stress play in all of this? What have you, and that mental health component, can you talk about that?
Well, I want to say it's kind of answering that question, and also picking up again still with the professional thing. In the addiction world, like Nora Volkov was like just stood out with this like seminal journal series that came out that really highlighted process addictions, including food. But the general feeling with addiction too is like, there I was, for example, me, drinking too much and then thinking I'll use food, and then that was okay. And that's actually a model that we propose. Like, even in the literature, it's like, if you have a craving for your substance, eat something, because that will take it away. And it does, and that's actually supported. And when we introduced the food addiction program into Renaissance, which is the place where I'm medical director, a lot of people said, what's wrong with that compared to their previous addiction, which will kill them tomorrow? And say, well, this will kill you in 5, 10, 20 years of diabetes and obesity related consequences, etc. But that it just wasn't seen as serious. Whereas I'm actually more focused on the mental obsessional piece, which now goes to the stress. When people are, food is bad, like sugar, refined processed foods are bad because they cause all sorts of derangement of our whole insulin profile. But it also really causes a problem with our natural ability to feel pleasure and happiness and reward, which is the whole dopamine system network. And stress will jog that, so that it's actually considered a trigger. Like, we have an acronym in the addiction world: hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And all of those are stresses to the body, which will cause a trigger to either pick up a cigarette or pick up food or pick up alcohol, a drink. And it becomes basically a trigger. And you could probably figure out the mechanics of that trigger. The stress brings up the sugar, which then leads to a dopamine spike in the brain, because dopamine and sugar are related. I mean, we know that. And so then you end up getting, a little bit of, we have this phrase in the addiction world, I have one and I want more. And so the one doesn't have to be a first drink. It could be just the anticipation of the drink. It could be one bite. Now I've got the bite and I'm anticipating the next bite, which is the dopamine now ramping up. I had one and now I want more. It's a hypersensitivity of the dopamine system, which is now sparked off by that one. And stress can be a first trigger to that whole process.
Yeah, we have, we have remote scales where literally we can watch this unfold, and we contact people when we see weight regain, or even before we see significant weight regain. We contact people when we see water weight gain, because water weight gain typically correlates with increased sugar and carbohydrate and increased salt, which is the common foods that people crave when they're stressed out. Yes. And when we contact them based on these individual parameters, if they have a CGM, certainly we pick up on that. 100% of the response is that they're under stress.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
I'm just going to repeat that. 100% of weight regain in our practice is from stress.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. One day we'll publish on this, Tro, because I'm telling you, I get, I have 4 patients who are struggling. All of them are middle-aged, menopausal, stressed out, diabetic or pre-diabetic. They don't have time to prepare meals. They don't have time to take care of themselves. They don't have to, they're crazy. They're late for meetings all the time. They're stressed out there. You could feel the stress coming from them, and they weigh themselves a bunch of times every day to see if they've lost weight again. And it's like this constant stress. And other people I have go, oh, I lost 5 more pounds. Okay. Like, they don't care. Okay, cool. Like they want to be healthier. And so sometimes that stress, that self-imposed stress, and not only that, the stress that causes them to binge, and then they feel like bad people for.
Yeah, that's right. So it just builds the stress. But, as you guys know, the stress will, make the person more insulin resistant. When that is a system that's hooked directly in with the whole dopamine thing. So the moment you feel more stress, you want more sweet, because the sweet, I guess, presumably means you're going to have more energy to deal with that stress, to respond to the stress. So they're close together. And I actually really believe that the more deranged the sort of sugar insulin profile changes, that there's a concomitant change with the addiction profile as well. Dopamine also starts to become deregulated. I think they're very close, they work very closely together.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of strong research showing that most of, it's not the acute stress that makes people hungry. It's when they escape the acute stress, now their blood sugar is falling down, now they're still having a comfort deficiency, and they're home, and the kids are asleep, and nobody's looking, right? Like that is the time, that's the time when hunger, and there's so much data now that glycemic variability is the language of hunger. Right? I mean, we focused, dopamine certainly is. Obviously, if, something tastes good and is sweet, we're going to want it more and we're going to crave that more. But a lot of that initial trigger, I'm convinced it's, glycemic variability is one of those things at least that we can modify. It takes abstinence to probably modify the dopamine signaling for a long time.
Yeah.
But the glycemic variability is something we can affect in one day.
Yeah.
One day without even addressing the dopamine.
Yeah.
But just to give you like a little, I've done experiments when I've tried to eat 24-hour fast, eat Greek yogurt. I can maybe eat 600 calories worth. Not that calories matter. If I add sweetness to it in any form, whether it's berries, whether it's Splenda, whether it's whole earth, erythritol, monk fruit, doesn't matter. I will blow through 600 calories and still be hungry. So I have
and
no
Tro,
other
you've
way.
always brought up that point, hyper-palatable food, right? Like for me, I bring hard-boiled eggs for lunch. Do I get excited about that? No, right? If it was barbecued ribs, I might be eating twice as much, but it's hard-boiled eggs, like, okay, I'm full, I'm not eating more eggs. It's not exciting to me, right? So there's a lot of that where, salted macadamia nuts versus plain, no excitement for me, right? Salted, I could eat all day. So people need to realize that too. Part of it's like, you can't just, like every meal doesn't have to be this exciting, like presentation, right?
100% agree. I hope we don't lose her again.
I am.
Vera,
Okay.
did we lose you?
It's frozen again on my end.
Gosh, it's so crazy because she's not frozen here.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Okay.
Are you back with us?
I think so. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, Brian was talking about that that there's exactly, the processed food component here, or not just the processed food, but making every meal extravagant.
That's all dopamine. That's the manipulation of dopamine. Yeah.
What are your feelings with the artificial sweeteners and using that as a bridge, or people who switch from regular Coke to Diet Coke or whatever? Do you have any feelings on that, or do you think it's best just to get rid of it all up front?
In the addiction world, that's called harm reduction, or like you said, a bridge, an aid. I think it's better if a person can. It's better to just stop completely, because you're just teasing yourself. The sweet anticipates sugar to come, and even if the sugar doesn't come, the dopamine is already risen, and the trigger is already, the flame to the fire has already been set. So you're then having to douse that flame. So if you can just stop, do. But if it keeps the person trying, if they just say, no, there's no way I'm going to do this, then okay, that's fine. It's still better. It's a reduction of harm. But the goal will be, if you want to have what we call peace of food serenity, food sobriety, you want to not eat sweets at all, of any kind, artificial or real. That's the goal, because what my goal is to remove the obsession from the brain, which is that dopamine. Obsession is just enhanced dopamine. And we want to get that back to its right size, which is just, I'm looking forward to having my lunch of hard-boiled eggs, and that's it.
Vera, I did another experiment on myself. I want to hear your thoughts. I ate till I was reasonably full. Well, first I remember this day very clearly. I was at my parents' house. They put out a big smorgasbord of food. I said, first, let me see if I could do vegan. And I ate a head of broccoli and a head of cauliflower. Okay. And at the end of it, my jaw hurt, but I was still hungry. Okay. And so I knew right away, okay, that doesn't work for me. then a little bit later in the day, after my bowels settled, I had about a pound of meat, and I was full. I was very full, and I felt very good. And then afterwards, they cut up watermelon, and I had one piece of watermelon, and that sweet taste just completely erased any feeling of fullness that I had had.
Yeah.
So what do you think was going on there?
That's called false hunger. That's the brain fooling you into thinking that you're hungry again. If you get that, that's the dopamine. So you've got the sweetness, that's the dopamine. Then there's that drive to eat, even though you're full. Because normally what happens is we have, a dopamine, which, inspired by the desire to eat, and ghrelin because you're hungry. I mean, it's all a system that works really well. And then as you eat, the leptin kicks in, suppresses the dopamine. You're full, and you're good. So that's what happened with the meat meal. It was your system working perfectly. But then what happens is the dopamine is spiked up again. And even though the break is there to say you're full, the leptin is still there, you're still full. The desire to eat overrides, and so it feels like hunger even though you're actually full. You talk to somebody who's binging and purging, they will say, I still want this, I still feel hunger, even though they feel the fullness, and they're actually having to throw up so that they can relieve the pain of that fullness. So it's a system where the checks and balances have gone awry, and it's not true hunger, but it feels like it.
You say that the checks and systems have gone awry, and I 50% believe that.
Okay.
And the other part of me says, if I was a grizzly bear who just ate a bunch of salmon and was presented a honey pot or berries, I would be the king grizzly bear, right? I would have loved that signal, the fact that different sensory and different taste and different sensation in my mouth makes me more hungry.
That's right.
That seems like, for me, it's like I'd be king grizzly bear.
Yeah, and that's perfect.
Yeah. So, but I simultaneously view it as pathology and normal.
Well, it's actually normal. So we are responding normally, but to an abnormal environment. So like normally, when would we have watermelon? In the summertime? And first of all, I don't believe that we should be eating as much grain and whatnot as we do anyway. I tend to be more of a paleo type of thinker. And so the amount of honey pots and whatnot are just, there may be some more at some point, and we'll eat more then, but the environment has its own control. But the way that our society, our food environment is such, it's like it's summer all the time, and it's abundant summer, and so we're responding because I think to some degree it's a synergy between me and the environment. And if we lived in a proper environment, we would be responding normally and eating normally, but we are responding normally to an abnormal environment. Our pathology is because of the environment that we're in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Kian, we talked about that when we had him on the podcast, talking about that. He says if it's seasonal fruit and you have it in your area, but when you look at the fruit you're eating, it's not coming from your local area. Generally,
exactly.
It's being shipped in from South America,
exactly.
wherever.
Yes.
And so it's very rare to find local, fresh, healthy food.
Yes.
Because the same people who make the argument that eating fruits and vegetables are saving the environment don't realize that that's being shipped all the way from South America here to San Diego, California.
Yeah.
There's cost to that. There's environmental cost to that too, rather than having locally raised cattle, for instance.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in such an agreement with everything you're saying, with what both of you guys are saying, that to some extent this is all like it's the environment is the cause. And if you go back to the environment as the cause, right? If the environment is the cause, what in the environment is it? Now, I know that there's a billboard for McDonald's on the highway. The raccoons that are also obese in the cities around me, I don't think they can interpret those signs, right? I don't think they can, there's a lot of screens in Times Square, that have commercials going on 24/7, I don't think the rats that are eating the pizza and getting massively obese, I don't think they're interpreting those commercials. So to what extent do you think, when we talk about environment and the role of environment, scientists talk about commercials, they talk about, they talk about being too calorically, dense. They talk about, video games causing inactivity, right? But these animal or not enough education about energetics and calories. The obese raccoons and rats, I'm not sure that they understand calories either. So I'm wondering if we should educate them.
No, we don't need to. We just have to throw away different garbage. Like if you look at what's in the garbage, it's the pizza. It's the the rest of Kentucky Fried Chicken that you didn't eat. It's not the Brussels sprouts, because people aren't cooking the Brussels sprouts. They're buying the pizza. So it's about accessibility. It's not. I don't think that people are choosing necessarily to just eat crappy food because they just think they should or something. I think it's we talk about food deserts, that sometimes that's the only food that's available. It's the only food that's available socially. Often you go to a party. I think it's at a level below even our choice. It's just what's available and what's deemed as normal. That's why things like your podcast, my podcast, like we are trying to change the norm of what is seen as acceptable. Just like smoking cigarettes, 10 years ago, people weren't smoking outside, shivering out in the cold. It was normal to smoke. Now it's not. I'd love to see it where people have to have their burger, they're not the burger part, but the other stuff, their sub outside, or their cheesecake, they have to go outside. And once we change that accessibility and that norm, it's not about choice, it's below choice.
Well, what about clearly we need to give those raccoons and rats like medications, like we should give them naltrexone, which is a medication for addiction that we use in obesity. I was thinking that we make sure to say, hey, it is okay to do bariatric surgery in adolescent raccoons. It is acceptable. And I was also hoping to, get like small calculators for the rats and raccoons to count their calories better. Do these sound like they're, what do you think
it's
when
hard.
you hear these?
Technically, it's hard. The wrists are so small and they're so hairy. It's hard to get a good reading. I'm
sure that the Apple Watch will figure it out somehow, even for those raccoons. So it's basically, somebody's going to make money off of this, so they'll figure it out. What I think of is these are great business opportunities. And, what we're proposing, which is to don't eat this stuff and eat low carb, basically not processed carbs, is there's no money to be made from this. We're stripping the profit out of the food industry.
And they're going to come after us. And they're going to come after us.
A perfect example is there's a show called Reversed where they, great people like Jason Fung, Maria Emmerich, they're going out to this episode's in Costa Rica where they help people reverse their diabetes. They put them in a resort. They get massages, they relax, they calm their nerves, they do all this stuff, they get them eating right, and they reverse their diabetes. Guess who's not sponsoring it? Pharma or Big Food. Right. You have to find a sponsor now. You put that on TV, they lose all their sponsors. That's a really, really tough issue, right? You don't think about things like that.
Yeah. That's right.
So how does, I want to come back a little bit to just the person listening to us. We've kind of had this conversation. Where does somebody get started? They're like, okay, they just did that cage questionnaire, listening to this podcast. They go listen to your podcast. How do they get started? I think I have a food addiction problem. Somebody's thinking that out there in the world. Can you help direct them? Where do they go?
Well, you mean like literally resources to go, or mentally?
Yeah, exactly. No, well, either one, both.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, to at least play with the concept that this is an addiction. So really entertain that. Is this something that if I want a little bit and I have it, I want more? And if there's any element of that, more to the point of impairment and obsession. So then think, okay, if I'm going to buy that, then the way to treat that is to abstain from it. So am I willing to abstain from that? Am I going to try and stop using it? Knowing, and I do want to emphasize this, that if you stop an addictive substance, the brain will readjust itself to, you have to get through the withdrawal piece, the tolerance and the withdrawal, and then it'll recalibrate back to where it should be. And that takes about 2 or 3 weeks. It doesn't take a lifetime. It doesn't take 6 months. It doesn't even take 3 months. It takes about 2 or 3 weeks of pure sobriety. Now, if you do the sweetener, it takes a bit longer. So if you can sit through that, then you will be on the other side and feeling a hell of a lot better. Now, how to get there, it's very hard. You're going to try to talk yourself out of it, so you want to get support. So where can you physically go for support? Well, you're not going to go to your local doctor. You're unfortunately, unless it's somebody who's known, you're going to read books like mine and others. There's more and more people talking about this. There's podcasts like this one, like mine. There's Facebook groups. I have my Facebook group, which I invite people to join. It's called I'm Sweet Enough, Sugar-Free for Life. There's actually a few good ones out there. Get support so that you build your own mini universe of people who are eating low carb, keto, or just simply sugar-free, which is basically the other two. So that you can not, because everything, most of our decisions are under the radar. And so we want to have support under the radar and feel that, at least in my day, because I'm talking to you now, I'm reading a book later and whatever, it's normal for me to live sugar-free. If I didn't have these connections, it would be normal to eat sugar and I would be tempted to eat sugar again. So I need to have that support. Like I said, there's various ways to get that. I think it's crucial.
Yeah, one of the things, I've done is I was so tired of people flying in to see me. I said, I'm just going to get licensed all throughout the nation because it's not acceptable. People have nowhere to turn to. You can't go to your doctor and say, I don't know why I keep eating ice cream at 1 a.m., after the kids are asleep. And your doctor will look at you and say, maybe eat less, move more, right? There's no understanding of the problem. There's no proper solution to the problem either. Which is a big, so we need people like you, Joe Niflin, Bitten Johnson, just to do what you're doing. Brian, what he's doing out in California. We need to expand this. And then how do people,
it's a tragedy.
How do people get a hold of you if they want to, they listen to you, how do the people get a hold of you if they're in Canada or wherever else, and they want to get a hold of you? How would they do that?
Well, they can check my website. I have addictionsunplugged.com, or I have my email, veratarmanmd.com. My Facebook group is probably a pretty straight. If you do Facebook at all, definitely join. So like I said, I'm Sweet Enough, Sugar-Free for Life. But the webpage is pretty good. And please read my book, Food Junkies.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are critical because I think people need to really step back. I know Joan Iflin's book has 2,000 scientific peer-reviewed articles in there, right? That she references. And so when you start saying this is not just, if you don't think it's real, you haven't looked and you haven't talked to people. I think that's it.
Yes.
When we see 400-pound diabetics who are their sugar's 400 and they're eating cookies, there's an addiction problem there. Everyone knows it's bad for you. I mean, it's like smoking when you got a risk of lung cancer. It's an addiction problem.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think we just have to change our approach and how we manage it, how we get down to the root cause, really, not just cover it up. We'll say, we'll give you this drug so you don't get hungry. Well, the mental aspects are still there. The addiction is still there.
That's right. And then the moment you go off those meds, you're in trouble.
So do you have any questions you want to grab onto?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions here, if you don't mind taking them.
Oh, that's fine.
So first question is from Anonymous. Okay, is abstinence necessary forever? Or is it possible to go back at some point?
Okay, well, if you are a true addict, I believe that it's necessary forever. If you're not, you could be just a troubled or harmful user that you may learn to be able to moderate at some point. I'm actually of the mindset that it's a continuum and that there is a point at which you can go and cross the line and there is no going back. The dopamine receptors, just like insulin receptors, can become so battered, deranged, that you can become functionally okay, providing you eat well, or don't use the substance. But the moment you do, like with dopamine, I do believe that at some point there's a kindled process that it's just like once you have a seizure, you're more likely to have seizures. Once you have had multiple experiences of this flare up of dopamine, it can be quiet for a long time because I'm not stressed and I'm not challenging the dopamine. But once there's a certain level of too much, like something sweet, then I will have trouble. It doesn't mean that you can't, by accident, ingest something sweet. It doesn't mean now you're a rabid addict again, but it doesn't take much. So it might take 2 or 3 or 4 exposures, and then you're starting to crave and then start to obsess. It's not been my experience that you can go back and then moderate later.
Yeah, I guess if it comes to that point, if you're thinking about that, one, there's probably some element of an issue, but then two,
yes,
do the least harm. Do the least harm. I think that's the way you think. And not everything's black and white. And, if you decide that that's the path you're going to go down and that's your decision, what is the least harm?
Can I, if I can just add one more piece, partly that question is also posed on the idea that there must be something normal about having a dessert once in a while. But if you see the sugar, it's like cigarettes. Once you quit, why would you want one once in a while, unless you think it's okay to do that? Normally people will go, oh my God, I'm glad I'm not doing this anymore. And most of us sugar addicts who are in recovery would think, I wouldn't even want that because it's so toxic. Why would you want to do something that will predispose you to Alzheimer's and whatnot later?
I'm thinking of so many, I can hear all the counterpoints in my head, but there have been, I think if you look at society, there have been societies that had carbohydrates, right? And did fairly well. So to what extent do you think, this is leading into the next question, why do you think there's so much cognitive dissonance on using carbohydrate restriction, lowering sugar, lowering carbohydrates to treat this issue, or just in general? Why is there so much cognitive dissonance about, lowering your sugar to deal with it? Like I was at Obesity Week, and I literally had a lecturer say that nobody is addicted to ice cream. They just think they are. So why do you think that this abstinence approach, lowering carbs, why is there so much cognitive dissonance about it?
Because we associate sugar and carbs with love, with affection, with comfort, which it does make us feel, and we have normalized that as an acceptable way to do that. In the same way that I used to literally buy a carton of cigarettes and a bottle of wine for a friend for Christmas 30 years ago, 20 years ago. I would never do that now because I don't see those things as acts of love or of comfort, but they are seen that way. So we just by virtue of our view of this is partly why I'm on a campaign, is to say it's a toxic substance. Let's stop associating it with normality and healthy, good food. That would be my main comment on that. And then if the person, and also I think that we're all addicts and nobody wants to give up their addiction, right? The using addict isn't going to
justify it. You justify it, and I see that all the time.
Exactly.
So everyone will say, here, you have a piece of dessert, have dessert, because they don't only have it by you don't want to be the only one drinking and no one else in the group's drinking. So you want someone to join you, right?
Yes.
So having a community is so critical.
It's absolutely.
Knowing you're not the only one who feels that way, because when we do our groups, a lot of times the next day people say, I didn't want to say anything because I'm the only one who doesn't have my act together, and then the next person, and then the next, they all say that the next day, but they don't want to contribute. The one person speaks up, then everyone says, yeah, I struggle with that too, I've had the same problem, right? And then they have a community.
Yeah.
I have one more question here, and then I think we'll call it. Why do you think some people are more likely to be addicted versus others who seemingly have no issue? Is it nature, nurture, both? What do you think?
Well, I think it's both. So first of all, we definitely have a genetic predisposition. So a person is more inclined to become alcoholic, addict, whatever. We've seen the crossover between obesity and alcoholism in research and in epidemiological research. So there's already some suggestion of a genetic thing, but there's also cultural or food, like I said, the food environment. The more exposure you have to foods, the more likely you are to get addicted. Nicole Avena has written books now, like her Mommy series of books, like How to Eat. How did your mother eat? That would affect how you ate, which will affect how your child eats. Because even in vitro, we can start to develop a stronger taste for sugar. Even beyond my personal control, it's already it's in the environment of in vitro. And then certainly the food around. If I'm eating cereal and cake as a child, I'm much more likely to continue to eat sugar. Just like if I started smoking pot at 7, I'm more likely to be a pothead at 17 and at 37. So exposure is a big issue.
I think that's a huge topic and a huge point, because people look at heroin addicts and you go, how can they shoot heroin in there? What's wrong with them? They just need to just quit that, because you're not addicted to heroin, but once you're addicted to that, you understand. So for Rob Sivas on episode 10, I would highly recommend everyone going back and listen to episode number 10 and 13 if you haven't already. But Rob really addressed a lot of these things, because he said, Brian, when's the last time you craved a cigarette? And I said, I don't smoke. I never crave a cigarette, right? And he said, once you just quit after 30 years of smoking, that's all you think about is cigarettes.
Yeah.
So it's just like someone else who's, whenever they get stressed, they want this cookie. When they can't have it, they freak out. It's stressful. It's scary. We've had Tronos too. We've had people cry when you say, hey, yeah, you should give up pizza. At least for now. And we can talk about that later, like not just today. Let's start work. But the emotional attachment we have, right?
Absolutely.
If you're stuck on a desert island somewhere, what are you going to eat? You're going to eat some animal that you could kill, a snake or whatever you can get, and some berries maybe off a tree or some fruit.
Yeah.
And then you say, okay, like you're not eating all these other fast foods and pizza. You're not going to make pizza on a desert island. You're going to be stuck there, right? So I think all those things, like when you're out camping, you don't make pizza. You're stuck in the middle of you're going to bring all this stuff and make that in the middle of the forest. So, things like that, where you start thinking, it's like, okay, the emotional attachment is so strong. And it's so, because we associate those things with happiness, with a funeral, with a birth, whatever it is, and there's so many connections there.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Absolutely. So let's wrap it up, guys. Patreon supporters, I just want to say thank you for supporting us. And guys, go out and get the book Food Junkies. Okay, this is by Dr. Vera Tarman. I've read it. It's a great book, and really makes the case for food addiction. And that's, I think, what we should call it, food addiction. Dr. Vera, thank you so much for all of your work, right? Everything that you're doing. And this is just absolutely necessary. And I can't wait to start listening to your podcast. So the Food Junkies podcast, I'm going to listen out for that.
Thank you so much for asking me. I'm really grateful.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. It was really amazing. I mean, this is such an important topic, and I think it's a topic that so many more people are going to start understanding. I think inherently we understand it, but we don't want to admit it. We don't want to say it's a real thing. So, but thank you for your hard work and all the years of dedication and helping people. And, what I see as the ideal is all of us connecting, right? Doing the medical stuff and doing the psychological work. And because it's not a one size fits all is what we're coming up with, and different people are going to have different approaches, and we have to figure out that person in front of us, and that's what makes the difference. So we greatly appreciate your contribution to what we do. It's very critical. So we thank you, because we can't do it without experts like you in this field.
Thank you.
Patreon supporters, thanks. Thank you for listening. We went a little long, but this is great. We appreciate your support. We're not going to get it from pharma or big food, so we have to depend on you. So we thank you for keeping us going, and thank you.